The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, observing the Rus Vikings along the Volga River in 922, wrote that they drank night and day until some died with drinking horns still in their hands. This wasn't celebration. This was ritual intoxication, a communal blurring of consciousness that made what came next seem inevitable. What came next was the bedding ceremony. And this is where modern people start to feel sick. Because what the sagas describe, what the legal codes confirm, what the archaeological evidence suggests, is that consummation wasn't private. It was witnessed. 6 people minimum, according to Icelandic law, escorted the bride and groom to the bridal chamber. These weren't strangers. These were family members, respected members of the community, people whose testimony would matter if the marriage was ever disputed. They had to see the couple enter the chamber. They had to verify both were present. They had to confirm the couple went to bed together. Most sources agree the witnesses left before actual intercourse occurred, but they stayed nearby. They remained close enough that if someone later claimed the marriage was never consummated, their testimony would prove otherwise. Let's sit with what this means for a peace bride specifically. She's 12 to 15 years old. She just met this man, or she barely knows him. She knows his family killed her relatives. She knows her family's peace, possibly their survival, depends on this marriage working. 6 people, us walked her to a room. They watched her climb into bed. They confirmed her husband climbed in beside her. Then they stepped outside, but not far, close enough to hear, close enough to testify. And now she's expected to consummate a marriage she never agreed to with a man she never chose, while her family's enemies wait just beyond the door to make sure it happens. The law didn't require her consent. Gragas, the Icelandic legal code translated by Andrew Dennis and others in 1980, is clear that fathers could arrange marriages without daughters' permission. The saga evidence shows this repeatedly. What the law did require was consummation. Without it, the marriage could be annulled. The payments would be disputed. The alliance would crumble. So the witnesses weren't there to protect the girl. They were there to protect the contract. The morning after, the husband gave his wife the morning gift, the morgengifu. This was witnessed to. Agothi or senior family members watched him present jewelry, land, cloth, or livestock. This was also when he gave her the keys to the household, iron keys that hung from her belt and marked her as mistress of the home. Those keys represented real power within the domestic sphere. She controlled food storage, textile production, brewing, slave management if they owned thralls, and child rearing. But she earned that power by surviving the wedding night, by going through with the consummation while witnesses waited, by not crying so loudly that people questioned whether she was willing, by doing what her family needed her to do regardless of what she wanted. And now the real work started. She was in enemy territory. Her birth family was days of travel away, possibly weeks depending on weather and season. Her job was to make this marriage succeed, to bear children who carried both bloodlines, to weave the families together with her body and her labor and her silence. The sagas preserve fragments of what happened to these women. Some became powerful. Al the Deep-Minded was a Norwegian chieftain's daughter who married a Viking in Dublin. When her husband and son died, she took control of the family fortune, organized a ship, sailed to Orkney and the Faroe Islands, and Iceland distributed land to her followers, and is remembered as one of Iceland's most important settlers. But Al was a widow with inherited wealth. Most peace brides didn't get that kind of autonomy. We also have records of women who resisted. Chapter 9 of Gisla Saga Skursner tells of Askur, accused of infidelity by her husband Horgrim, who forbids her from their bed. She doesn't accept it quietly. The saga records her pushing back, creating household chaos until the situation explodes. Women weren't passive, but pushing back had costs. If the marriage failed, if the peace bride left or died or divorced, the alliance died with her. The families might return to blood feud, the careful negotiations, the silver payments, the years of planning, all of it would collapse. And everyone would know who to blame, the woman who couldn't make it work. The woman who valued her own comfort over her family's survival. The woman who failed to be a good enough peace weaver. Now add the slave variable, because this is where the system gets even darker. If a wealthy man couldn't afford the bride price for a free woman, or if he wanted additional wives or concubines, he could buy slaves. The Graga's legal code explicitly states a man was entitled to purchase a slave woman specifically for sexual pleasure. These weren't marriages, these were legally sanctioned rapes. But children born from these unions complicated the social structure. If the father acknowledged the child, his family owed 2/3 of the child's support. If he didn't acknowledge it, the child remained the property of the mother's owner. DNA studies published in multiple journals, including recent genetic research, show that up to 50% of Iceland's founding female population had maternal ancestry from Ireland and the British Isles. These weren't voluntary migrants. These were captured women. The Annals of Ulster, compiled from 9th century sources, record the year 821 with brutal clarity. Houses were plundered by the heathens, and they carried off a great number of women into captivity. Not a raid for gold, a raid for women. In 832, a fleet under the Viking leader Turgeis invaded Ireland's northern and eastern coasts. The slave markets in Dublin, Hidibi, and Burka turned human trafficking into an economic engine. Archaeological digs at Wood Quay in Dublin recovered iron slave collars in 1874 and again in 1962. These weren't restraints for cattle. These were restraints for people, and some of those enslaved women were eventually married off to create alliances, their legal status shifting from slave to wife, but their trauma remaining unchanged. The peace bride existed in the gap between these extremes. She had legal rights. She could own property. She could divorce. But she had minimal agency. She was free but functioned as a hostage. Her body was the contract, and if she broke it, people died. Let's end with Helga. Chapter 5 of Gunnlaug's saga tells her story. She's betrothed at 13 to a man she despises. The saga states she and her husband never again enjoyed intimacy after the wedding night. But the marriage happened because the contract was binding. Helga spent years in a loveless union because her family needed the alliance. When her husband finally died, she took the wedding shirt her first love had given her decades earlier, unfolded it, stared at it, and died of grief. The saga presents this as a romantic tragedy. It's actually a horror story. A girl was promised to a man she hated, forced through a wedding night she didn't want, kept in a marriage that destroyed her, and died clutching a piece of cloth that represented the life she could have had if her body hadn't been sold for peace. That's the reality of peace brides. Not women weaving families together in some mystical act of feminine power. Not romantic medieval alliances sealed with love. But girls, often just children, used as human collateral in a system that valued stability over consent, alliances over autonomy, peace over their personhood. If this account has disturbed you, if you found yourself imagining what it would feel like to be 12 years old and told you were going to marry your family's enemy, if you wondered how any society could consider this normal, then you've understood something important about history. The past wasn't more innocent, it was often more brutal, and the women whose bodies were used to prevent war paid a price we can barely fathom from our comfortable distance. These documented practices aren't legend. They're not exaggerated saga tales or Viking mythology. They're recorded in legal codes, confirmed by archaeological evidence, and preserved in the sagas precisely because they were so common they barely rated as noteworthy. That's perhaps the most chilling part. To the people who lived through it, this was just how marriage worked, how peace was maintained, how families survived, and the girls who climbed into those beds with 6 witnesses watching from the doorway were doing what countless women throughout history have done, sacrificing themselves for everyone else's idea of the greater good, whether they wanted to or not. If you found this deep dive into the darker corners of Viking history compelling, subscribe to support our work uncovering the historical truths that textbooks often sanitize. This kind of research takes time and dedication to get right. Now I want to hear from you. Knowing what you now know about peace brides, how do you think this practice shaped not just Viking society, but the women who survived it. Share your thoughts in the comments below.